This December, Marvel will be bringing us Avengers Doomsday, which, based on the cast that has been revealed so far, looks like it's shaping up to be an epic culmination of over 25 years of Marvel movies. So to prep, I'm spending the year watching every PG and PG-13 Marvel movie and TV show, and we'll be not only breaking it up by decade, but I'm also planning to do a big all-inclusive ranking of every PG and PG-13 Marvel movie and show shortly after Doomsday releases. I've spent the month watching the movies from the 2000s, which, with two exceptions, is pre-MCU. The reason it's the 2000s is, even though I did watch Howard the Duck, it's the only pre-2000s Marvel movie that isn't rated R, and it doesn't really make sense to include it. So here's my ranking of the PG and PG-13 2000s Marvel movies from worst to best. In last place, Spider-Man 3. I don't think I need to get into a lot of detail as to why this one is last place. People have been saying the same complaints for almost 20 years now. It's overstuffed, it doesn't make sense to retcon Uncle Ben's killer, Venom is both miscast and shoehorned in the last 20 minutes, the film has awful pacing and even worse writing. There are a few moments that work, like it has some cool fight scenes between Sandman and Harry, but the symbiote suit arc is thinly written and kinda loses its message. For example, Peter, while under the influence of the Venom alien, actually slaps MJ, and that's inexcusable, and yet, by the end of the film, she still goes back to him. They also try to set up Gwen Stacy as a potential love interest because they were planning to do Spider-Man 4, and they were testing this out as a new love interest, along with Black Cat, just in case Kirsten Dunst didn't want to come back for Spider-Man 4, and there was going to be this love triangle between Peter, Gwen, and Black Cat. Sam Raimi has later gone on record saying the Black Suit storyline was his idea, but including the actual character of Venom was going to be saved for a future movie, but because Venom was such a popular character in the 90s with the animated series, and they wanted to capitalize on that nostalgia, the studio essentially forced Raimi to include the actual character of Venom as the third act villain. This was a case of too many cooks in the kitchen, messing up what could have been a truly epic conclusion to the trilogy that it greatly deserved, especially with how great Spider-Man 2 was, and everything got that film set up. But, unfortunately, they just fumbled the ball at the last second. What we got is just pathetic and painful. Number 13, Hulk from 2003. This is not a great movie by any means, but the reason it's above Spider-Man 3 is this is the first Hulk movie, and it doesn't have the legacy of previous films to compare it to, which makes it stand on its own in terms of quality judgment a bit better, and there's certainly no other comic book movie like it. It certainly has a very unique style by using comic book panels as scene transitions, but that element is overdone. It should have been used more sparingly instead of every 5 minutes, because after the first couple of times it goes from being cool and unique to being annoying and headache-inducing. And the pacing and editing feel like a 2-hour trailer, constantly cutting, constantly shifting, like it's afraid to sit still long enough to get you invested. Which brings me to the biggest issue. It's not that compelling as a Hulk story. Hulk is the Jekyll and Hyde superhero. Rage, repression, trauma, but the movie never really digs into the classic psyche in a satisfying way. It hints at big emotional ideas, but it doesn't land them with enough clarity or momentum. And since the plot moves so slowly, it feels like you're waiting forever for something meaningful to happen. And honestly, nothing of note really kicks in until the last half hour. And when the action finally ramps up, the effects are rough. Like, really rough. The CGI and live action do not blend well at all, and sometimes it looks straight up fan-made. There are moments that reminded me of the "what am I looking at" vibe of movies like Son of the Mask. It's hard to feel the weight of Hulk when the visuals keep yanking you out of the movie. The villain situation doesn't help either. The movie sets up Nick Nolte like he's going to be this big looming threat, but he barely does anything until the final stretch. And even then, it's underwhelming. So you spend most of the runtime waiting for the conflict to arrive, and then when it does, it's not even that satisfying. It's the definition of an ambitious experiment that just doesn't come together. To paraphrase Jeff Goldblum from Jurassic Park, you do eventually plan to have Hulk in the Hulk movie, right? Hello? Hello? Number 12, The Incredible Hulk from 2008. Also, not a particularly great movie. It also suffers greatly from pacing issues. It has a different actor and director. Instead of saying, yeah, this is a separate thing, it tries to connect itself to the 2003 Hulk by showing the origin story during the opening credits. And to some degree, I get what they were going for with that. I mean, the Sam Raimi films did that, but Sam Raimi Spider-Man films did that. But the reason that worked is it used comic book art, and it felt like that enhanced the opening credits in those Spider-Man films. Here, it's live-action footage, so it feels like we're watching an episode of a show with a previously on, except it's not a show. And to some degree, it's kind of trying to be. It's trying to emulate the show from the 70s, but it's so disconnected and the continuity is confusing by saying the 2003 Hulk movie is not MCU, but also this is a sequel to that movie. But we're also not acknowledging that movie as canon. There's a version of this movie that could have worked well, but the one we got is just lifeless. For a character known for explosive rage and internal turmoil, the film spends a surprising amount of time feeling flat and emotionally distant. On its own, it also feels very out of place in the MCU, even for Phase 1. It doesn't have the wit of Iron Man, the mythic grandeur of Thor, or even the intensity later brought on by films like the Avengers. It leans hard into grounded military thriller territory, but without enough character depth to justify the seriousness. The result is a movie that is just oddly bland and safe. The plot itself isn't especially compelling. It's essentially a chase movie. Banner running, General Ross chasing, repeat. There's very little escalation or thematic layering beyond man who tries to suppress monster. And while that core idea is interesting, the film doesn't dig deep enough into Bruce's psyche. We don't truly feel his isolation, guilt, or fear the way we should. The emotional weight just is not there. Now, Edward Norton certainly gives a perfectly fine performance, but it feels too restrained. Bruce Banner should feel like a man constantly on the edge, trembling between control and chaos. Instead, he feels very cardboard cutout and milquetoast. The romance with Betty Ross also lacks spark, making the reunion feel more of a mandatory plotline checkbox than actually genuine. Now, credit where it's due, there are moments where the film works. A few sequences genuinely tap into classic monster movie vibes. The university battle has that chaotic, almost tragic horror energy, and the final act fight between Hulk and Abomination is the movie finally waking up in the last act. The destruction, the sense of two titans colliding, that's when it feels alive, but it takes so long to get there. Ultimately, apart from a few monster movie-inspired highlights, the film is this long. It lacks urgency, it lacks personality, and it lacks the emotional hook needed to make Bruce Banner's tragedy resonate. It's not aggressively bad, it's just dull. And in a franchise built on energy and character-driven spectacle, dull is almost worse. It's the kind of movie you forgot you watch the day after watching it. Number 11, Elektra. I'm just going to say it up front, this should have been a prequel. The biggest mistake in Elektra is the decision to bring her back to life after the events of Daredevil. Instead of leaning into the emotional weight of her death, the movie jumps through hoops to resurrect her. And for what? So much of the film was already devoted to flashbacks about her childhood and training that it practically functions as an origin story anyway. If the film had simply committed to making this a prequel, showing Elektra before she met Matt Murdock, the entire thing would have made more narrative sense. Because here's the issue. Once she's brought back, the story doesn't meaningfully connect to Daredevil. She's not with Matt. She's not interacting with the world of that film. The resurrection feels like a plot point rather than a necessity. Ironically, in real life, Ben Affleck and Jennifer Garner were married at the time this movie came out, so if anything, a prequel would have made their separation less awkward within the narrative. Instead, the film awkwardly sidelines Daredevil entirely, making the character's resurrection feel entirely pointless. And then there's the romance with the character of Mark. I just don't buy it. There's very little chemistry, and their relationship feels very underdeveloped. It's one of those we need emotional stakes subplots that never really earns its payoff. If Elektra is supposed to be this isolated assassin struggling with connection, the film doesn't really fully commit to that arc. The romance exists, but it doesn't transform her in any profound way, and it certainly does not justify the time spent on it. The larger problem is the plot just is not that interesting compared to Daredevil, which at least had stronger character conflict and a more memorable villain dynamic. This film feels smaller and less focused. The hand are present, but they don't feel particularly threatening or well developed. The movie leans heavily into mysticism and training flashbacks, but it never builds tension in a satisfying way. You can really tell this was an era where Hollywood hadn't really cracked the code on comic book movies yet. This is pre-MCU, pre-The Dark Knight. Studios were still experimenting, sometimes mistaking style and seriousness for depth. Elektra wants to be moody and mythic, but often comes across as flat and emotionally distant. It's not unwatchable. There are moments where Jennifer Garner commits fully to the role, and the action is decent. The aesthetic has its moments, but the execution feels like a missed opportunity. If this had been a straight origin story, or some smaller scale prequel exploring Elektra's training and moral conflict, this could have been something special. But instead, it lands in that mid-2000s comic book camp. It's watchable, but it's clearly from a time the studios were still figuring it out. A decent attempt at a standalone character piece, but weighed down by unnecessary resurrection, undercooked romance, and a plot that never really fully justifies its existence. It could and should have been much better. Number 10, Fantastic Four. While this is not a great movie by any stretch, no pun intended, because Mr. Fantastic stretches, it did come out at a time when Hollywood was still trying to figure out what the formula for a truly great comic book movie would look like. Again, pre-MCU, pre-Dark Knight, studios were still experimenting, still throwing things at the wall to see what stuck. Because of that, I find this one a bit more forgivable. It feels like a stepping stone rather than a failure. There's still value here. Apart from Jessica Alba, who I think was drastically miscast as Sue Storm, the cast actually does a solid job. One thing this movie gets right that the 2015 reboot didn't is the age of the actors. These actors at least feel like they're in the right age to play these characters, which helps ground the team dynamic, whereas 2015 they were all way, way too young. And there are moments where their chemistry works. You can see glimpses of the family dynamic Fantastic Four is supposed to embody. Chris Evans is easily the standout. Long before he picked up the shield as Captain America, he plays Johnny Storm exactly the way you'd want. Cocky, arrogant, impulsive, and just charismatic enough that you still like him. He brings some energy to the movie whenever he's on screen. It's fun seeing him lean fully into the reckless bad boy persona. That said, this feels less like a Fantastic Four movie and more like a Thing movie. Ben Grimm is essentially the main character, but to the film's credit, they actually handle him pretty well. Hospice former life, the security, the desire to be accepted despite looking like a rock monster. His arc has weight, and it gives the movie a heart it might otherwise lack. The third act is where things start to fall apart. It feels rushed, like they realize they need to wrap everything up quickly. Dr. Doom is severely underused, it never quite feels like the imposing, larger-than-life villain he should be. He's there, but he's not fully realized, and that hurts the final battle. Still, for its time, this is a decent enough film. It's flawed, absolutely, but it's watchable, occasionally charming, and a fascinating snapshot of the era before studios cracked the code on comic book storytelling. It may not be fantastic, but it's far from the worst attempt at bringing Marvel's first family to the screen. Number 9, X-Men The Last Stand. This is one of the most frustrating X-Men movies, because the template for a great story is absolutely there. The mutant cure storyline is genuinely compelling. The idea that there's a cure for mutation immediately sparks powerful ethical debates. Is mutation something that needs fixing? Is it a disease or an identity? Watching characters wrestle with that question, especially Rogue, is one of the more emotionally grand aspects of the film. It feels like a natural escalation of the discrimination themes the franchise was built on. There's real philosophical weight there. And then there's the introduction of Kelsey Grammer as Beast, who is honestly one of the film's brightest spots. He looks straight out of the comics, and he brings warmth, intelligence, and dignity to the role. His scene in the lab discussing the cure is one of the few moments where the movie slows down enough to let its themes breathe. But, unfortunately, the movie doesn't slow down very often. The biggest issue is that it tries to juggle two massive storylines at once, the cure and the Dark Phoenix saga. Either one of those arcs could have carried an entire film trilogy on its own. Instead, the Dark Phoenix plotline is rushed, underdeveloped, and feels more like a subplot than the seismic emotional tragedy it should be. Jean's transformation lacks the psychological build-up that made the storyline so iconic in the comics and animated series. It ends up feeling abrupt rather than inevitable. And then there's Juggernaut. A character who should feel unstoppable and terrifying is reduced to meme-worthy dialogue and comic relief. He may have gotten laughs in 2006, but it completely undercuts the menace. It feels like he wandered in from a different tone of movie entirely. The film also suffers from having too many characters and not enough focus. Cyclops is dispatched almost immediately, Professor X is killed halfway through, and several other major characters are written off in ways that feel more shocking than they are satisfying. Their deaths were so controversial that the later films, like Days of Future Past, essentially hit the reset button, and that alone tells you something. Still, it's not all bad. The final battle at Alcatraz has scale and spectacle. Magneto moving the Golden Gate Bridge is still a visually iconic moment. There's a sense of ambition here that deserves credit. And for a mid-2000s superhero movie, it attempts darker, more morally complex storytelling than many of its peers. But ambition without focus is where it ultimately stumbles. Instead of feeling like the epic conclusion to a trilogy, it feels like a rushed attempt to wrap up every storyline at once. The emotional arcs aren't given time to land, the Dark Phoenix saga deserved far more build-up, and the cure debate, arguably the most interesting idea in the film, gets overshadowed by CGI spectacle. It had the potential to be the franchise's Return of the King or Avengers Endgame. Instead, it became the trilogy's most divisive entry. Number 8, Ghost Rider. When it comes to casting, I just don't think Nicolas Cage was the right choice for Johnny Blaze. I get that Cage is a huge comic book fan and genuinely loves the character, but I never fully bought him as his tortured, hardened vigilante. Ghost Rider is often portrayed as a darker, Punisher-adjacent anti-hero, someone intense, brooding, and intimidating. Cage brings a quirky, eccentric energy that doesn't really match that vibe. Someone like Keanu Reeves, who can play quiet intensity more naturally, might have fit the role better. That said, Sam Elliott is easily the best part of the movie. He completely commits. While everyone else seems aware they're in a cheesy mid-2000s comic book adaptation, Elliott plays like a straight Western drama. His presence has gravitas, and honestly, his scenes are the ones that feel the most authentic to the tone Ghost Rider probably should have had. Stylistically, the movie screams mid-2000s. The opening credits, the CGI, the color grading, the editing, it all feels very specific to that era. At the time, it may have looked cutting edge, but now it feels kind of dated, but also kind of charmingly dated. CGI, especially during some of the transformation action sequences, don't hold up particularly well. That being said, they're still kind of cool visually. The flaming skull design is iconic, even if the effects around it haven't aged all that well. Now, in terms of tone, the movie has the aesthetic that feels closer to something like Buffy the Vampire Slayer or Supernatural than a Marvel movie. That's not necessarily a bad thing, but it does make the movie feel smaller, almost like a TV pilot stretched out to feature length. The stakes never feel quite as epic as they should for a character who literally rides out of hell. There are some genuinely entertaining cheesy comic book one-liners sprinkled throughout, and I'll admit, a few of them made me chuckle. The movie knows it's campy at times, and that camp factor can be fun.
You guilty.
Mother, you're alive. Too bad you will die.
Number 6, X-Men Origins Wolverine. One of those movies that sounds like a great idea on paper, give the most popular X-Men character his own gritty revenge story, but the execution leaves a lot to be desired. First off, the biggest issue is that it's redundant. By the time this movie came out, we'd already spent 3 films with Logan and X-Men, X-Men Ignited, and The Last Stand. We already understood his amnesia, his Weapon X experimentation, his drama, and his isolation. The movie tries to dig deeper, but instead of adding meaningful new layers, it mostly retreads ground we've covered, just louder and with better CGI. And, of course, the big elephant in the room is Deadpool. The direction they took with Wade Wilson is still one of the most controversial decisions in comic movie history. Casting Reynolds is perfect, he gets the character, and that's why they reused him when the Deadpool movies actually came out, but they literally silence him or turn him into a CGI mutant experiment in the final act. It's such a baffling misunderstanding of what makes Deadpool work that it almost feels like parody. Like I said, though, he does redeem the character in the Deadpool movies, but it's rough here. You can also clearly see the studio trying to launch an entire X-Men Origins franchise, because that was initially the plan. If you went on IMDb around the time this movie came out, you could see the movies in production were X-Men Origins Gambit, X-Men Origins Magneto, X-Men Origins Cyclops. So Gambit gets introduced like he's about to headline his own movie, Cyclops is there for some reason, turns about Magneto floating around. It doesn't feel organic, it just feels like a checklist. Instead of focusing tightly on Logan's emotional arc, the film gets distracted by trying to set up spin-offs that never even happened anyway. That said, there is a solid revenge story buried in here. The first half actually worked pretty well. Logan losing Silver Fox and going on a brutal Rangefield mission feels very much in the vein of Liam Neeson's Taken. Raw, personal, driven by grief. Hugh Jackman commits fully as always. He is Wolverine. His physicality and emotional intensity carry large portions of the film. But then comes the third act twist that ruins the entire movie. Silver Fox was alive the whole time. That reveal undoes the entire emotional core of the story. The pain, the betrayal, the motivation, and all loses weight because the tragedy wasn't even real. Instead of feeling clever, it just feels stupid and manipulative. The movie trades genuine heartbreak for a plot twist, and it weakens the whole third act. It just feels like a plot twist for the sake of the plot twist. The final battle is another mixed bag. There are some cool moments. Seeing Logan fully weaponized, for example, that was cool, but the heavy CGI cause and rushed pacing make it feel more artificial than intense. The attempt to escalate things with Weapon 11, Deadpool, just pushes it further into cartoon territory. Overall, X-Men Origins Wolverine isn't a complete disaster. It has strong casting and compelling premise and moments of genuine grit, but it never fully earns its emotional beats. It tries to be a revenge thriller, a franchise launcher, and an origin story all at once, and it ends up being a compromised version of all three. If anything, if it proves one thing, it's that sometimes the mystery is more powerful than the explanation. Quick note here, I realized after filming the first take of this video for almost 45 minutes that I actually forgot to include X-Men Origins Wolverine, so that's why Daredevil is still listed as number 6, even though it should be number 5. I don't want to have to go back and refilm what I already made, because I already spent so much time on it the first time. So there you go, there's my fixed mistake. Number 6, Daredevil. This is one of those movies that wants to be gritty and grounded, but keeps tripping over its own early 2000s instincts. It's got attitude, some legitimately cool visual flair, and surprisingly solid hand-to-hand choreography, but also has the problem of tell don't show that never stops nagging at you. The biggest issue, the movie just won't shut up. Instead of letting scenes breathe, it leans on narration and direct explanation to spell everything out, like it's worried you'll miss the point unless it reads you the SparkNotes version of Matt Murdock's Pain. And that's frustrating, because visually the movie actually does have style. It has this cool street-level tone before it was cool. For all its flaws, Daredevil deserves credit for pushing Marvel into a more grounded, realistic street-level vibe earlier than most people remember. Matt isn't trying to save the universe. He's living in a corrupt city and trying to claw justice out of it with his fist and his conscience. That urban vigilante and a dark, gritty world tone is a big reason the movie still has a fan base, although a very small one. Honestly, The fight choreography and stunts are genuinely well done. When the movie commits to physical actions to a CGI spectacle, it's at its best. The bad? The CGI looks like a video game trailer. Even by 2003 standards, the CGI is rough. And not just dated, it's more like a cutscene from a PS2 game, and undercuts the ground and tone whenever the film tries to flex visually. And seeing Jon Favreau here is wild, because it feels like a preview of the vibe he later brings to the MCU as Happy Hogan. Same energy, wise, sarcastic best friend who keeps the lead semi-functional. It's one of those, oh, this guy's been playing the archetype forever moments. Colin Farrell's Bullseye is a choice. He chews the scenery pretty well, but the character barely does anything. Also, the multiverse joke writes itself now. Colin Farrell played Bullseye here, but then he later shows up in the DC world as Penguin, meaning the DCU Batman fights the Bat-Rays Penguin. Comic book casting is a beautiful mess. This soundtrack is aggressively early 2000s. The needle drops feel like the movie is trying to be edgy by blasting whatever would have been a mixtape next to your Spider-Man poster. It's not subtle, and sometimes it works, but sometimes it becomes accidental comedy. The Evanescence song used in here is a perfect example. There's such a specific tonal slap in the face that it can make the dramatic scenes feel laughable. Like, the movie thinks it's still very tragic intensity, but the music turns into music video vibes, like something you'd see in a Hot Topic. Joe Pantoliano brings in as this reporter and appearing as himself in the MCU Wonder Man show is the kind of thing that causes instant fandom logic. Like, does this movie exist in the MCU as a movie? And if it does, what does that mean for Charlie Cox's Daredevil? Is it a fictionalized version of some real MCU Daredevil? And if so, why is Kingpin played by Oracle Clark Duncan? And why is Jon Favreau just the MCU in it? And I don't know, if the MCU treats this as an in-universe film because Joe Pantoliano plays himself in Wonder Man, meaning that every movie he's been in exists in the MCU, it doesn't make sense. This is just a movie in their world with actor coincidences. Otherwise, you end up in a logic not where the MCU has to explain why Happy Hogan is also this random lawyer's best friend in the Daredevil movie. It's fun to joke about, but it's impossible to make sense. The movie is a time capsule. Stylish shots, solid stunts, and a surprisingly important step toward Marvel street-level storytelling. But it's wrapped in clunky narration, ugly CGI, and the most 2000 soundtrack decisions imaginable. It has its fun moments, and it's absolutely interesting, and you can feel the DNA of later superhero trends hiding inside a movie that still thinks edgy, with Evanescence over the rooftops. Now, keep in mind there is a huge, huge gap between those and these. These top 5 are movies I actually really liked. Number 5, X-Men. This is a movie that, while it can be campy, it also knows when to take itself seriously. The character introductions are well done, from the opening scene of a young Magneto in a Nazi concentration camp, to Wolverine's fight scene introducing Rogue, who's the replacement for Jubilee from the animated series, and who essentially serves as the surrogate for the audience as she is the one receiving information about this world. The actors are so iconic and perfectly cast that Disney knew they couldn't replace them for the MCU lest the fans revolt. It feels like a live-action episode of a cartoon from the 90s. It has the first ever Stan Lee cameo, and what's most interesting is that this is a superhero movie that doesn't have a lot of action compared to the superhero films of today. The only major action sequence is in the last 20 minutes. But even then, the film is so well done with great characters, it doesn't feel like a slog. And for the life of me, I can't figure out why this is PG-13. It's very mild in its violence and language, there's no sexual content or nudity, it's PG. And it's a great kickoff to lay the groundwork for films like Spider-Man. Number 4, X2, X-Men United. The rare sequel that outdoes the original in pretty much every way that matters. Bigger stakes, sharper momentum, stronger action, and a plot that actually moves like a thriller instead of a setup. That opening scene is still one of the all-time greats. Nightcrawler invading the White House is one of the best opens in any comic book movie. Instantly iconic, genuinely intense, tells you everything you need to know about him in one sequence. He is the best new character here. Mysterious, sympathetic, visually creative, and just cool in a way that early 2000s superhero movies didn't always get right. What I love most is how the film balances the spectacle with character. The mutant-human tension feels more urgent, the team dynamic is tighter, and the action set pieces have real narrative weight instead of just being fight because fight. The whole movie has this paranoid, hunted energy that gives it an edge and makes it feel more mature without trying too hard. The romance threads hit harder too, because they're built around the franchise's best emotional hook. Wanting connection, but being afraid of what you are. Rogue and Bobby are sweet in that aching we can't really be normal way, and Jean and Logan carry that new gravity. Two people drawn together while knowing it can't end cleanly. Both couples mirror each other, different vibes, same tragedy. It's one of the cleanest examples of a superhero sequel leveling up. It's more confident, more cinematic, and more emotionally textured. Number 3, Iron Man. A film that, given its ingredients, was a huge gamble. Films like X-Men The Last Stand, Fantastic Four, Superman Returns, and Spider-Man 3 were not very well received by critics or audiences, causing many to believe that, apart from Christopher Nolan's Batman films, only the first of which had been released at the time, The comic book film genre was more or less dead. Then, out of nowhere, a newly formed studio called Marvel Studios announced they're making a film about Iron Man, a character that, outside of the niche comic book community, nobody had really heard of. Sure, Iron Man had a cartoon in the 90s, but it wasn't as successful as the other comic book cartoons running at the time, such as X-Men or Batman, and it only lasted 26 episodes. On top of that, they announced that the character would be played by Robert Downey Jr., who at the time was an actor that nobody wanted to work with due to his substance abuse problems. On top of that, Jon Favreau was announced as the director. Favreau had directed films before, but his only two successful ones were Elf and Zathura, and even then, those were family films, not big blockbusters. By all accounts, this formula should not have worked, yet it somehow had all the right ingredients to pull it off. Robert Downey Jr.'s charisma and comedic timing really helped the film, as well as its big, exciting action sequences. While other comic book movies, for the most part, were a bit sillier and more cartoonish, this one felt like it was taking itself seriously. And even though, personally, I don't really care for Iron Man as a character, I have to acknowledge it is a very well-made film. This is one of the only films from Phase 1 that still holds up, the other two being Captain America and the Avengers. Our runner-up is Spider-Man. When this film swung into theaters in 2002, it didn't just launch a franchise, it helped define what a modern superhero movie could be. Looking back, it's a classic origin story told with sincerity, style, and just enough early 2000s awkwardness to make it charming. The film plays like a modern myth. Peter Parker's transformation, the bite, the wrestling match, Uncle Ben's death, the alley confrontation, unfolds with genuine emotion. Director Sam Raimi leans fully into earnest storytelling. There's no self-aware winking at the camera. The movie believes in Spider-Man, and that belief gives it weight. That being said, it's not flawless. Tobey Maguire captures Peter's shy internalized awkwardness well, but he stretches credibility as a high school senior. Even by senior year standards, he looks noticeably older. He looks like he's in his 30s. And while the upside-down kiss became instantly iconic, the romantic chemistry between Maguire and Kirsten Dunst never really quite clicks. Their relationship feels more required by the script than organically developed. Kirsten Dunst just cannot act to save her life in this movie. Willem Dafoe, however, is electric. His Norman Osborn is theatrical, intense, and genuinely unsettling, especially in the mirror scenes with the split personality taking center stage. It's one of the stronger villain performances in the early superhero era. Unfortunately, the Green Goblin's costume is far less effective. The rigid mask robs Dafoe of his expressive face. At times, the suit looks more like a toy than it is threatening. The Unity Day festival fight even borders on camp, resembling chaotic parade mayhem more than calculated supervillain terror. It looks like a scene out of Jingle All the Way.
I have a special delivery for you.
Oh, it appears that Turbo Man has saved...
Impressive!
Still, the brutal fight battle of the raid redeems much of that silliness. The script syncs wildly between sharp emotional beats and clunky dialogue. Lines like this:
You're pathetically predictable. Like a moth to the flame. What about my generous proposal? Are you in or are you out?
It's you who's out, Gobby. Out of your mind.
Wrong answer!
feel rough, even for 2002. There are also some gaps in the narrative logic. Peter uses webs in the cafeteria with no consequences, for example. Like, he has the lunch tray and he drags it with his webs, and nobody makes the connection that there's a web-swinging superhero later. They're like, maybe that was Peter. Like, we saw him fight and he was able to backflip, and he's never been able to do that before. This guy is kind of an acrobatic superhero, maybe. That felt like no one puts that together. Interestingly, the movie pulls influence from Ultimate Spider-Man rather than strictly adapting the Amazing Spider-Man comics. The wrestling storyline, for example, is far more aligned with the Ultimate comic story arc than the original 1960s run. It gives the film a slightly modernized feel while still feeling classic. One area where the film absolutely soars is the music. Danny Elfman delivers an unforgettable theme that elevates nearly every scene. The score injects heroism, tragedy, and grandeur into moments that might otherwise feel simplistic. It's one of the most iconic superhero themes ever composed. Perhaps the film's strongest emotional thread is Harry Osborn. The dramatic irony of Harry valuing revenge on Spider-Man while Peter stands beside him as his best friend adds genuine tragedy. That thread carries forward beautifully into the sequel, or at least Spider-Man 2. Spider-Man is sometimes silly, it's occasionally awkward, the effects haven't aged perfectly, and some of the dialogue feels a bit silly, but its sincerity, heart, and mythic tone still resonate. It may not be the most polished Superman film, but it remains one of the most important, a foundational chapter in modern superhero cinema. And number one is the best Marvel film from the 2000s, Spider-Man 2. This isn't just a sequel that raises the stakes. It's a sequel that deepens the soul of the character. When the first film focused on the origin story, this one explores the consequences. It asks what happens after the costume, after the promise, after the responsibility become a daily burden. Peter Parker is now a struggling college student, barely holding his life together. He forgets his own birthday. He loses jobs. He misses his classes. He disappoints Mary Jane. He alienates Harry. He's constantly late, constantly exhausted, constantly failing at balancing life as a student and life as Spider-Man. That's exactly what makes him so relatable. He doesn't have the problems of a billionaire in a high-tech suit. He isn't a scientist wrestling with gamma radiation. He isn't a god cast down from another realm. He's just a broke kid trying to do the right thing, and paying for it. The film's central idea is burnout. Peter's powers begin to fade, not because of a scientific explanation, but because of emotional and psychological strain. The loss isn't clearly defined in medical terms, but thematically it works. His identity as Spider-Man is tied to his belief in responsibility. When he starts to doubt that calling, his abilities falter. It's less about the biology and more about the purpose. When he gives up the suit, the raindrops keep falling and the head montage is undeniably corny. It almost looks like a Coke commercial.
Never gonna stop the rain by complaining.
Excellent work today, Parker. Keep it up.
Coke. Share the taste. But effectively captures that brief freeing relief of setting down impossible weight. Of course, the world doesn't stop needing heroes. Alfred Molina's Dr. Octopus is one of the strongest comic book villains of the 2000s era. He isn't portrayed as purely evil. Otto Octavius is brilliant, ambitious, and tragically arrogant. His refusal to recognize his limits leads to catastrophe. Once the inhibitor chip fails, he becomes a victim of his own invention. Raimi injects full horror energy into the hospital scene where the mechanical arms massacre the surgeons. It's dark, intense, and unmistakably Sam Raimi. Some of the action leads slightly artificial. The big fight feels staged like a video game boss battle, but the train sequence is legendary. Spider-Man stopping a runaway train is one of the most iconic superhero moments ever filmed. When the passengers gently carry his unmasked body and promise to protect his identity, the film crystallizes his central theme, sacrifice. Perhaps the most heartbreaking moment, though, comes when Peter, temporarily powerless, rescues a child from a burning building. He later learns someone else inside didn't survive. The guilt is crushing. Even if he had his powers, he might have sensed them, might have moved faster, might have saved them. The film understands something essential about heroism. To quote Spider-Ham and Into the Spider-Verse, sometimes the hardest part of the job is you can't save everyone. The rift between Peter and Harry is handled beautifully. Harry's grief over his father festers under resentment, and the final scene, discovering Norman's goblin lair, lands as an incredible cliffhanger. The promise of him taking up the mantle feels tragic and inevitable, which makes its later execution in Spider-Man 3 all the more disappointing. But here, it works perfectly. Danny Elfman's score once again elevates everything. The themes swell with triumph, sorrow, and grandeur. It gives Peter's eternal struggle with mythic weight without losing the grand emotional core. Spider-Man 2 succeeds because it understands that the real battle isn't just against Doc Ock. It's against exhaustion, doubt, and sacrifice. Peter Parker isn't compelling because he can stop trains. He's compelling because he can't pay rent. And that's why the film remains one of the best superheroes ever made, and the best Marvel film of the 2000s. So we know you're ranking from this list, and you can include the Blade movies if you want. You can include Howard the Duck, even though they don't technically qualify for the list. But if you want to include all those like pre-MCU movies, you can. Let me know what your ranking is, and I'll see you next time.